April 3rd, 2023. The lawyer's conference room smelled like furniture polish and the kind of money Rebecca Thompson would never have. Mahogany desk leather chairs that probably cost more than her 13-year-old Honda Civic parked 3 floors below. She sat across from a man in a gray suit who slid a check across the polished surface with practiced efficiency, the gesture so smooth it must have ended 100 marriages before hers. $38,000, her fingers still bearing the pale indent where a wedding ring had lived for 20 years until she'd removed it that morning, picked up the slip of paper. The lawyer had misspelled her name, Rebecca instead of Rebecca, one missing C, like she'd been erased a little bit more with each year of her marriage, until even legal documents couldn't quite see her clearly. 20 years of being Robert Williams's wife. 20 years of her identity wrapped around someone else like ivy on a fence post, growing in whatever direction he pointed. And this check, this rectangle with her name wrong, was what the court decided those years were worth. The lawyer cleared his throat. The sound had been perfected over decades, designed to move clients along without appearing rushed. His tie probably cost more than her monthly grocery budget. "What are you going to do now, Mrs. Thompson?" Rebecca looked at her reflection in the window behind him. 42 years old, blonde hair she'd kept shoulder length because Robert preferred it that way, though gray threads were showing at her temples now. Blue eyes that looked too pale in the fluorescent lighting, washed out like old denim left in the sun too long. She'd worn a navy dress to the final hearing, something professional and forgettable, the kind of outfit that said she wasn't going to make a scene even though her entire life was being divided into numbers on paper. "I don't know." The honesty tasted like admitting failure, like standing up in a crowded room and announcing she'd wasted 2 decades learning to be small. The lawyer's face arranged itself into an expression she recognized from working in dental offices, polite concern that didn't quite reach the eyes, the look you gave patients when you needed them to leave so you could see the next appointment. "Well, you'll want to find housing first, get settled, then maybe think about employment. Your dental hygienist license is still current, isn't it?" The motel room she'd been living in for the past week cost $65 a night. She'd done the math on the back of a receipt from the gas station down the road, the numbers getting uglier each time she calculated them. At that rate, the $38,000 would last 17 months if she didn't eat, didn't drive, didn't exist beyond occupying 12 feet of industrial carpet and a bed that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke from previous tenants who'd also been temporary, also passing through. Rebecca stood smoothing the navy dress over hips that felt unfamiliar after losing 15 pounds she hadn't meant to lose. Stress did that, turned your body into something you didn't recognize, just like the marriage had. The check went into her purse, the same leather bag Robert had bought her 3 Christmases ago because he said her old one looked cheap. "Thank you for everything." Walking out of that office into April sunshine felt like stepping off a cliff in slow motion, the ground rushing up but not arriving, just the endless falling. Her car sat in the parking lot next to BMWs and Teslas, the crack in her windshield spreading a little more each week, a slow fracture she couldn't afford to fix. She sat behind the wheel and stared at the check again. Rebecca Thompson. They couldn't even get her name right on the document that ended her marriage. The motel was 15 minutes away, just off Highway 30, outside Cedar Rapids. She'd memorized the pattern of water stains on the ceiling above the bed, the way the air conditioning unit rattled When it cycled on the exact shade of brown, the curtains turned in afternoon light. 7 days of living there, and she already felt like she was dissolving into the floral wallpaper, becoming another temporary ghost in a room designed for people with nowhere else to go. Her laptop sat open on the desk that doubled as a dining table, the screen still showing apartment listings she'd been scrolling through since dawn. 18 places in the past week. Every single one wanted first month. Last month, security deposit. The cheapest required $4,000 just to get keys. And then there was furniture, utilities, groceries, gas insurance. The $38,000 was already bleeding out before she'd even cashed the check, her future draining away in deposits and application fees and all the hidden costs of starting over. The cursor blinked in the search bar, patient and indifferent. She typed apartments, Cedar Rapids, then deleted it. Typed housing, deleted that too. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, and something shifted in her chest, not quite rebellion, more like the feeling of standing at the edge of deep water and realizing the shallow end was behind her, had been behind her for a long time, and the only choice was to swim or drown. She typed foreclosures, Iowa, farmland. The idea came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Her grandfather had farmed 300 acres up near Waterloo back when she was a girl, before everything changed. She remembered summer visits when she was 8, 9, 10 years old. The smell of diesel and cut hay, the way the land stretched so far you could see weather coming an hour before it arrived. Thunderstorms building on the horizon like dark castles, the air going still and electric before the first drops fell. He'd died when she was 10, and her father had sold the farm, immediately moved them to town, got a job at the John Deere plant. But she remembered. The search results loaded. Pages of properties, most in the six-figure range acreages, with pristine houses and outbuildings that looked like they'd been photographed for magazines. Everything perfect, everything expensive, everything impossible. She scrolled past them looking for something else, something broken enough to be affordable. The listing appeared on page 4, 80 acres, Warren County, bank foreclosure, minimum bid $25,000. The photos showed a farmhouse with a hole in the roof, visible even from the exterior, shot a gap in the shingles big enough that you could probably drop a basketball through it. The barn leaned left, like it was trying to lie down after decades of standing upright. Fields choked with weeds that had gone to seed waves of brown and yellow where crops should have been green. The equipment shed in one picture framed a tractor buried under what looked like years of dust and bird droppings, a ghost of machinery that might have run once, but probably never would again. She clicked through the photos twice, then a third time, her heart doing something strange in her chest. The ad had been posted 6 months ago, updated 3 times with price reductions. Nobody wanted it. The place was too far gone, too much work, too expensive to fix for what it was worth. A money pit, Robert would have called it. A disaster waiting to bankrupt whoever was stupid enough to buy it. Rebecca zoomed in on the photo of the tractor. She couldn't tell the make from the image quality, but it sat in that shed like something abandoned, forgotten, written off. The caption underneath read, "Equipment included, as is no warranties." Her phone buzzed. Robert's number, the 4th time he'd called since the hearing, each call a little more insistent than the last. She let it go to voicemail, already knowing what he'd say. He'd want to make sure she understood about the bank accounts, about his lawyer's fees that had come out of her half, about how she needed to be smart with the settlement because it was all she was getting, and he wasn't responsible for her anymore, had never really been responsible for her in the ways that mattered. The phone stopped buzzing. Rebecca looked at the farm listing again, at that tractor sitting in shadows at 80 acres nobody wanted. The price sat there like a dare. $25,000 minimum bid. If she bought it, that would leave $13,000 for everything else. For tools and repairs and property taxes and all the things she didn't know enough to know she'd need. She saved the listing to her favorites and closed the laptop. That night, lying in the motel bed that felt like sleeping on cardboard wrapped in scratchy sheets, she ran numbers in her head until they stopped making sense, until exhaustion pulled her under into dreams about endless fields and machinery she didn't know how to operate. By morning, she'd convinced herself the farm idea was insane. By lunch, she'd called the bank handling the foreclosure and asked about viewing the property. April 15th, Ashley came home for the weekend, pulling up to the motel in the Subaru that was technically in Rebecca's name, but that her daughter had been driving since her senior year of high school. 19 years old, home from her sophomore year at University of Iowa, blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing sweatpants and a hoodie with the Hawkeyes logo across the chest. She took one look at the motel room, and her face did something complicated, all the emotions cycling through too fast to name but easy enough to read. Worry, pity, anger, fear. Mom, you can't keep staying here. Rebecca had made coffee in the room's miniature pot, the kind that brewed 2 cups of something that tasted like burnt plastic but was hot and caffeinated, and therefore acceptable. She'd learned to lower her standards for a lot of things in the past 2 weeks. I know, I've been looking at apartments. Ashley sat on the bed, the same spot Rebecca had been occupying for a week, and pulled out her phone with the efficient movements of someone who'd already done research, already had solutions lined up. There's a complex near campus that has 1 bedrooms for $900 a month. I can help you look. $900 plus utilities, plus internet, plus parking. Rebecca had already looked at that complex. The application fee alone was $200 just for the privilege of being considered, and they wanted proof of income at 3 times the monthly rent. $2,700 a month. Her part-time dental hygienist work brought in $1,600 on a good month. Actually, I found something else. I wanted to talk to you about it. The way Ashley's shoulders tensed said she already knew this conversation wasn't going to be about a sensible 1-bedroom with updated appliances and a gym she'd never use. Rebecca pulled up the farm listing on her laptop, turned it so her daughter could see, watched Ashley's expression shift from confusion to concern to something that looked uncomfortably close to fear. Mom, what is this? It's 80 acres. There's a house, a barn equipment. It's going to auction next week. Ashley zoomed in on the photos, her fingers quick on the trackpad, familiar with technology, in the way Rebecca never quite managed to be. The hole in the roof, the leaning barn, the overgrown fields that looked more like a nature preserve than farmland. This place is a disaster. It's affordable. Ashley's voice came out sharper than she probably intended, but the words hung there between them like an accusation that had been building for weeks. You're a dental hygienist. You can't even change a tire. That landed harder because it was true. 20 years of marriage to a man who'd insisted on handling anything mechanical, anything physical, anything that required tools or strength or knowledge he believed belonged to men. She'd called AAA when she had a flat. She'd called Robert when the garbage disposal stopped working. She'd learned helplessness so thoroughly it had become part of her identity. Another thing Robert had chosen for her, and she'd accepted because it was easier than fighting. I can learn. Ashley closed the laptop, the screen going dark with a decisive click. This is crazy. Dad said you weren't thinking straight. Rebecca's hands went cold, the coffee cup suddenly too heavy. You talked to your father about this? He called me. He's worried about you. Of course he'd called. Of course he was monitoring, managing, making sure his version of events got told first, that he could position himself as the concerned ex-husband dealing with an unstable ex-wife who couldn't be trusted to make reasonable decisions. 20 years of that pattern and apparently divorce papers didn't change it. What I do with my settlement isn't his business anymore. Ashley's eyes went wet at the edges, tears threatening but not quite falling. I know you're angry at him. I get it. But buying a farm, Mom, that's not anger. That's self-destruction. The motel air conditioning kicked on with its familiar rattle, filling the silence with white noise that did nothing to ease the tension. Rebecca looked at her daughter, this young woman who'd watched her mother shrink and defer and disappear for 2 decades, who'd learned by example that women accommodated and men decided that some people got to want things and other people got to manage the wanting of the people who mattered more. I'm going to see the property Thursday. You can come with me if you want. Ashley shook her head, the movement small but final. I have class. Then I'll go alone. Her daughter left an hour later, the Subaru's engine fading into the distance, and Rebecca sat in the motel room, feeling the weight of 20 years pressing down like water every choice she'd made, every time she'd said yes when she meant no, every moment of becoming smaller so Robert could feel bigger. The settlement check sat in her purse, and she understood with sudden clarity that it wasn't really about the money. It was about whether she was going to keep living like someone who needed permission. Thursday morning arrived gray and cool, the kind of April weather that couldn't decide between winter and spring clouds, hanging low enough to touch. Rebecca drove 2 hours north into Warren County, following GPS directions that took her off the highway onto county roads, then gravel, then a driveway so overgrown with grass it barely qualified as a path. The farmhouse looked worse in person, somehow smaller and more damaged than the photos suggested. Paint peeled from the siding in long strips, exposing weathered wood underneath. The front porch sagged in the middle, like a broken backboards, warped from years of rain and snow, and nobody caring enough to fix them. The bank agent arrived 10 minutes late in a silver Lexus that looked absurd next to the decay chrome wheels picking up mud from the driveway like jewelry on someone who'd wandered into the wrong neighborhood. Mid-40s Navy suit, the kind of carefully maintained appearance that said he spent more on his haircut than most people spent on groceries. Mrs. Thompson. His handshake was brief, professional, already dismissive in the way he pulled his hand back quickly, like he might catch something from her, from this place, from the whole situation. I have to tell you, this property needs significant work, heavy work. He paused, and Rebecca could see him calculating how to phrase what came next, how to ask the question he wanted to ask without sounding like what he was. Do you have a husband, brother, someone who can help with the repairs? Rebecca felt something cold settle behind her ribs, ice forming around her spine. Just me. The agent's expression shifted through several variations of polite concern, landing somewhere between skepticism and condescension. "Well, let me show you the house first." They walked through rooms that smelled like mold and mouse droppings, the odor thick enough to taste. The kitchen sink hung loose from the wall, held by a single pipe that would probably give out completely if anyone tried to use it. The bathroom had no running water, rust stains in the tub like dried blood. Holes in the floors opened onto crawl spaces, below dark spaces where anything could be living, anything could be rotting. The agent kept up a running commentary about load-bearing walls and foundation issues and electrical systems that hadn't been updated since the 1970s, his voice taking on that careful tone people used when they thought you were making a mistake, but didn't want to be rude about stopping you. The barn was worse. The doors hung from broken hinges, gaps between boards, letting in enough light to see the dirt floor, ancient hay bales decomposing in one corner, rust coating every metal surface, like a disease that had spread unchecked for years. Equipment's in the machine shed. They crossed what used to be a yard, now just weeds and volunteer trees pushing up through soil that hadn't seen a mower in half a decade. The metal building had somehow stayed more intact than everything else, walls straight, roof unbroken. The agent pulled open the door, and Rebecca stepped into dusty darkness that smelled like old grease and bird nests, the air thick with particles that swirled in the light from the doorway. The tractor sat against the back wall. It took her eyes a moment to adjust, to separate the machine from the shadows, to understand what she was looking at. Red paint faded to dusty pink in places where sun came through gaps in the metal siding. Rust freckled across the hood like age spots spreading along seams and edges where water had collected over years of neglect. The front tires were flat rubber, cracked like old leather left too long in an attic. Bird droppings covered the seat, the steering wheel, the exhaust stack layers of white and gray that spoke to seasons of abandonment. "That's a 1955 Alice Chalmers WD. Been sitting here at least 5 years, maybe longer. Hasn't run in all that time." The agent pulled out his phone, checking messages, while he talked, already moving on to whatever appointment came after this one, whatever property actually had a chance of selling to someone who could afford it. Probably worth more as scrap metal than as a tractor. Honestly, you could have someone haul it off, maybe get a few $100s. Rebecca walked closer. Dust hung in the air where her footsteps disturbed it, particles dancing in shafts of light that cut through the shed's dimness. She could see scratches in the paint dents in the sheet metal, all the small violences of a long working life. The steering wheel had worn smooth in places where hands had gripped it year after year, the metal underneath showing through like bone through skin. She reached out and touched the hood, feeling rust rough under her fingers, the metal cold even though it was almost May. This machine had outlived its usefulness, been abandoned, written off. 68 years old and sitting in shadows, forgotten by everyone who'd ever needed it. This was included with the property. The agent was already moving toward the door, done with this part of the tour, ready to finish the walkthrough so he could mark another failed showing in whatever system tracked properties nobody wanted. "Everything you see is included as is. No warranties, no guarantees." He paused in the doorway, sunlight cutting around his silhouette. "The auction's Monday. Minimum bid is $25,000. To be honest, Mrs. Thompson, I'm not sure this property is what you're looking for." Have you considered something more manageable? Maybe a condo? Rebecca stood in that shed with her hand on cold metal, looking at a machine that had outlived its usefulness, been abandoned, written off as worthless. Something about the tractor called to her in a way she couldn't articulate, couldn't explain to this man in his expensive suit who'd already decided she was wasting his time. Not nostalgia, not sentiment. Something deeper, like recognizing yourself in a stranger's face, like looking in a mirror and seeing not what you were, but what you could become if you refused to accept that broken meant finished. I'll see you Monday at the auction. The drive back to Cedar Rapids took 2 hours and felt like traveling between universes, the farmland giving way to suburbs, giving way to the motel parking lot where her Civic sat among cars belonging to people who also had nowhere permanent to be. By the time she pulled in, she'd talked herself out of bidding 3 times. By morning, she'd decided to do it anyway. Robert called Sunday night. His voice came through the phone with that edge it got when he was trying to sound reasonable while being condescending, a tone she'd heard for 20 years. Whenever she suggested anything, he didn't approve of anything that deviated from the life he'd planned for both of them. Ashley told me what you're planning. Rebecca, this is insane. The farm is a good investment. It's a ruin. You don't know anything about farming. I'll learn. Robert's laugh came through the phone like a slap, sharp enough to make her pull the receiver away from her ear. You can't even balance a checkbook without help. You think you're going to run a farm? The line between them filled with everything she'd never said, all the times she'd swallowed responses and smiled, and agreed all the years of being told what she could and couldn't do until she'd started to believe it herself. The settlement is mine. What I do with it isn't your concern anymore. This is why I handled our finances. This is exactly why. You're not thinking clearly. She hung up while he was still talking, the click of disconnection more satisfying than she'd expected. Her hand was shaking. 20 years of listening to that voice, that certainty, that absolute conviction that he knew better, that she couldn't be trusted with decisions, with money, with her own life. Monday morning, April 22nd. Rebecca drove back to Warren County wearing jeans and a flannel shirt she'd bought at Walmart the day before, the fabric stiff and uncomfortable tags itching against her neck until she'd pulled them off in the parking lot. The auction was held on the front lawn of the farmhouse. Folding chairs set up in rows facing a podium someone had driven out in the back of a pickup truck. 15 people showed up, most of them older men in work clothes, farmers checking out a neighbor's foreclosure, the kind of people who knew equipment values and soil quality, and which properties were worth saving. Rebecca sat in the back row. The auctioneer was a heavy-set man in his 60s, wearing a cowboy hat and bolo tie, and he started the proceedings with practiced efficiency. All right, folks, 80 acres here, house and outbuildings, included equipment, as is. Banks asking $25,000 minimum. He went through the particulars: property taxes, easements, water rights. His voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of someone who'd done this hundreds of times, who could sell anything to anyone if the price was right and the crowd was willing. Who'll give me 25? Silence. The farmers shifted in their seats, boots scraping against grass. One older man in the front row shook his head slowly, definitively. The auctioneer tried again. 25,000 for 80 acres. More silence. Rebecca felt her heart hammering against her ribs, each beat loud enough she was certain everyone could hear it. She raised her hand. The auctioneer looked at her, then around at the crowd waiting for someone else to bid, waiting for this to be a real auction instead of a foreclosure. Nobody wanted. No one moved. Got 25 from the lady in back. Anyone else? A farmer in the third row turned around to look at her, his expression trying to figure out if she knew what she was doing, if she understood what she was buying, if she had any idea what 80 acres of neglect would cost to bring back to something worth owning. The auctioneer called out twice more, his voice echoing across the farmyard, bouncing off the house with its broken roof, the barn that leaned like it might fall at any moment, sold to bidder 12 for $25,000. The paperwork took an hour. Rebecca signed her name spelled correctly, this time 17 times, her hand cramping by the end. She wrote a check that left her with $13,000 between herself and complete ruin, the numbers feeling both enormous and impossibly small. The bank agent handed over keys that felt too small and ordinary for what they represented, for the weight of what she'd just done. "Congratulations, Mrs. Thompson. The property transfers immediately. You understand the condition it's in. I understand. Who's going to run the equipment for you? Handle the repairs?" Rebecca stood gathering the papers into a folder. She'd brought the same one she'd used for her divorce documents because she didn't own enough folders for all the ways her life was changing. "I am." The agent's skepticism was written across his face, but he'd been paid his commission, and what happened next wasn't his problem, wasn't his concern. "Good luck. You're going to need it." Walking across that property with keys in her pocket felt like stepping into someone else's life, like wearing clothes that didn't fit, but might if she grew into them, if she became someone new. The farmhouse with its broken roof was hers. The leaning barn was hers. The 80 acres of overgrown fields spreading out in every direction, they were hers, too, bought with money that was supposed to last her until she figured out what came next. She walked to the machine shed and stood looking at the Alice Chalmers in afternoon light, filtering through gaps in the walls, dust motes dancing in the beams like tiny stars. 68 years old, the agent had said. Almost 70 years of existing, of working, of being useful, until it wasn't any more, until someone parked it in this shed and walked away and never came back. Rebecca climbed onto the seat, feeling bird droppings crack under her weight, the sound sharp in the quiet of the shed. The steering wheel was cold. She gripped it anyway, her hands fitting into grooves worn by decades of other hands, generations of farmers who'd sat here and steered this machine across fields, who'd trusted it to do the work that needed doing. Something inside her chest cracked open, not breaking, but opening like ice in spring. For the first time in 20 years, something was entirely hers, not chosen by Robert, not approved by someone who thought they knew better, not contingent on being good enough, or quiet enough, or small enough to deserve it. This farm, this tractor, this gamble that everyone said would fail, it belonged to her because she'd chosen it, because she'd raised her hand when no one else would. She sat there as the sun moved lower, painting the shed walls orange and gold, and whispered to the machine beneath her, "We're both going to run again." Move-in day happened piecemeal. Over the next week, Rebecca hauling boxes from the motel in trips that felt both significant and pathetic. 20 years of marriage reduced to 3 cardboard boxes and whatever fit in her Civic's trunk. air mattress camping stove cooler for food because the farmhouse refrigerator had died years ago and would cost more to replace than she could afford. Most of the furniture from the marriage had been Robert's choices anyway, things she'd never liked, but lived with because he'd picked them because his taste mattered more than hers in the house they'd shared. Ashley didn't come, sent a text instead, 8 words that carried the weight of disappointment and fear in equal measure. "I can't watch you do this." Rebecca read the message 3 times in the farmhouse kitchen with its peeling wallpaper and water-stained ceiling, then put her phone away and kept unpacking. Andrew Miller showed up unannounced on day 3, his Ford pickup rattling up the driveway in a cloud of dust. 20 years old, sandy brown hair, freckles across his nose that made him look younger than he was. Ashley's boyfriend since her freshman year, though Rebecca suspected that relationship was fraying, now that Ashley had seen what her mother was attempting, now that the chaos of this choice had become real. Mrs. Thompson. His presence felt like an apology. Ashley couldn't make herself a gesture of concern, wrapped in denim and work boots. Rebecca was hauling 5-gallon water containers from town, the well pump dead, and the prospect of fixing it looming like every other broken system on this property. She'd been using a camping lantern after dark because the electricity worked in theory, but half the outlets sparked when you tried to plug anything in. "Ashley's worried about you. Tell her I'm fine." Andrew looked at the farmhouse, at the tarp she'd managed to stretch over the hole in the roof, using rope and determination and a ladder that probably shouldn't have held her weight. His eyes tracked to the well pump housing rust-covered metal box with wiring that looked older than both of them combined. "Are you?" Rebecca set down the water container, her arms aching. The question deserved an honest answer, but she didn't have one that wouldn't sound defensive, or foolish, or both. Andrew crouched by the well pump, examining connections she'd been staring at for 2 days without understanding. "Pressure switch is probably shot. You could replace it for about $40. Something loosened in Rebecca's chest, not quite hope, but close to it. "Could you show me how?" That night she sat on the air mattress in the one room with an intact ceiling, watching YouTube videos on well pump repair by the light of her camping lantern. The video quality was terrible, filmed on someone's phone years ago, the sound cutting out at crucial moments. She watched it 6 times until the steps made sense, until she could picture the process clearly enough to attempt it herself. Morning came with the kind of spring cold that hadn't decided to let go of winter yet. Rebecca drove to the Farm Supply Co-op in Indianola, the closest town big enough to have agricultural equipment. The building sat on the edge of Main Street, corrugated metal siding, painted green parking lot full of pickup trucks that cost more than her entire settlement. Inside smelled like fertilizer and leather and diesel fuel aisles, stacked with supplies she couldn't identify, tools whose purposes remained mysterious. She'd written "pressure switch" on a piece of paper torn from a spiral notebook, her handwriting shaky from nerves. The woman behind the counter was in her early 50s, steel gray hair pulled back, face weathered in the way that came from years of outdoor work. Name tag read, "Carol Martin, manager. Help you find something. I need a pressure switch for my well pump." Carol studied her with eyes that had seen plenty of customers come through enough to categorize people quickly. "This for your husband? It's for my well." The assessment in Carol's gaze shifted slightly, recalculating. "Well, pump repair can be complicated. You sure you don't want to call a plumber? I can give you some names." Rebecca took the box with the pressure switch inside, the weight of it solid and real in her hands. "I'll figure it out." Back at the farm, she followed the YouTube instructions with hands that shook from adrenaline and doubt in equal measure. Turned off the breaker, disconnected the old switch, the wiring not matching the video exactly, because nothing in this house matched anything from the modern world. She had to stop twice to rewatch sections to compare what the instructor showed with what she was seeing, to understand the differences and adapt. Sweat ran down her back, despite the morning cool, when she finally reconnected everything and flipped the breaker. Nothing happened for 5 seconds that felt like 5 hours, long enough for her to imagine all the ways this could fail, all the money she might have wasted, all the reasons Robert had been right about her inability to handle mechanical tasks. Then the pump kicked on, grinding sound that smoothed into a steady hum, water pressure building in pipes that hadn't carried flow in years. She turned on the kitchen faucet, and brown water sputtered out, clearing after a moment, running clean enough that she could almost believe this was working, that she was capable of fixing broken systems if she just refused to quit. Rebecca stood at that sink watching water flow and started crying actual sobs that came from somewhere deeper than relief. She'd fixed something. With her own hands and her own knowledge gained from a grainy YouTube video and determination born from having no other choice, she'd taken a broken system and made it work. She called Ashley from the porch, sitting on steps that creaked under her weight. "The water's running. I fixed the well pump myself." Her daughter's voice came back uncertain, like she didn't know whether to be impressed or more worried. That's good, Mom. I watched a video, bought the part, installed it." The line filled with complicated silence, all the things Ashley wanted to say, but couldn't quite voice. "I'm proud of you." Rebecca looked around the kitchen through the open door at the peeling wallpaper and exposed wiring and the 100 other things that needed fixing. "I need to learn how to fix the tractor next." Mid-May brought heat that turned the machine shed into an oven. By noon, metal walls, radiating warmth that made the air shimmer. Rebecca had ordered an Alice Chalmers shop manual online, $45 she couldn't really afford, but needed more than food, more than comfort. 200 pages of technical diagrams and specifications, dense text that assumed knowledge she didn't have, terminology that might as well have been a foreign language. She read it cover to cover by camping lantern that first night, taking notes on things she didn't understand, creating a list of questions that grew longer with each page. Then she turned to YouTube, typing 1955 Alice Chalmers WD restoration into the search bar. The channel she found was called Old Iron Revival, some guy in Montana who restored vintage tractors in videos that ran 40 minutes each. She watched a 12-part series on a similar model, the host explaining every step with patience and detail that made her believe this was possible, that machines weren't magic, just systems that could be understood if you took the time to learn. After her dental hygienist shifts 16 hours a week at a clinic that had hired her back because they needed someone who'd work part-time and wouldn't complain about the schedule, she'd come home to the machine shed. Lady became her project, her teacher, her companion in the isolation of this choice. Week 1, she drained the oil following manual page 47. The drain plug was stuck from rust and neglect, wouldn't budge, even when she put her full weight on the wrench. YouTube search, how to remove stuck drain plug. Penetrating oil, wait overnight, try again. The black sludge that finally poured out, looked like tar thick with metal particles and contamination from years of sitting. Her hands were covered in it within minutes, oil under her nails and soaked into the creases of her palms. For 20 years she'd kept her hands immaculate for dental work, scrubbed clean and moisturized, the hands of someone who worked in other people's mouths and needed to inspire confidence through cleanliness. These hands looked different now, capable, useful, marked by labor that produced visible results. Weeks 2 and 3 consumed her with the carburetor. She removed it, following diagrams in the manual laid out every tiny part on a clean rag spread across the workbench she'd made from sawhorses and plywood. Took photos with her phone so she'd remember assembly order, because the manual's exploded view diagram made sense, until she actually had 40 small pieces in front of her and couldn't tell which jet was which. She cleaned each component with solvent and wire brush, talking to Lady while she worked, because the silence of the shed felt too heavy, otherwise too full of doubt. "Okay, girl, let's see if these jets are clogged." They were. Carbon deposits thick enough to explain why this engine had struggled before someone parked it for the last time. "Your float valve's stuck. We'll fix that." One-sided conversations that made her feel less alone, less overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was attempting. The tractor couldn't judge her, couldn't tell her she was failing, couldn't measure her against expectations she'd never be able to meet. While working one afternoon, hands deep in carburetor parts, slick with solvent, Robert's voice came back unbidden. Memory from 10 years ago, when she'd suggested learning to change her own oil, save the money they spent at quick lube places. "You're not mechanical. You'll break something expensive." She'd believed him, accepted his assessment of her limitations because he said it with such certainty, because 20 years of marriage had trained her to trust his judgment over her own instincts. Rebecca looked at the carburetor laid out before her, at parts she'd successfully disassembled and cleaned and understood well enough to put back together. He was wrong about a lot of things. She reassembled the carburetor over 6 hours, checking her work against the manual 3 times, testing each connection, making sure every piece fit exactly as the diagram showed. When she finally bolted it back onto the engine, her hands were cramping and her back ached from hunching over the work, but the satisfaction ran deeper than physical discomfort. Week 4 brought spark plugs and battery charging and final preparations. She removed the old plugs fouled from sitting, gapped new ones to .025 inches, following specifications in the manual. The battery sat on a trickle charger Andrew had left behind, slowly accumulating voltage after years of being dead. She tested compression in the cylinders, using a gauge she'd bought at Carol's Co-op. The older woman's skepticism softening slightly each time Rebecca came in, knowing what she needed, able to ask intelligent questions about specifications and compatibility. All 4 cylinders showed readings within acceptable range. Lady's engine was ready. May 20th arrived with a morning cool that promised afternoon heat. Rebecca climbed onto the tractor seat, her heart doing strange things in her chest palms, sweating despite the chill. She'd been preparing for this moment for 3 weeks, teaching herself through videos and manuals and trial and error. But now that it was here, the doubt crashed over her like a wave. What if it doesn't start? What if she'd done something wrong, broken something expensive? Just like Robert had predicted, wasted weeks and money and hope on a machine that was never going to run again, She gripped the key that she'd worked free with W.D. 40 days ago, the metal cold against her palm. Please work. Please. First attempt. The key turned starter motor, grinding with a sound like metal teeth trying to bite through resistance. Engine turned over, once, twice a cough that held promise for half a second before dying completely. Her heart sank. She climbed down, checked the choke setting, realized she'd set it too rich, adjusted it, following the manual's cold start procedure, climbed back up. Second attempt. The starter cranked engine, struggling against 5 years of stillness compression. Fighting back against pistons that hadn't moved in so long. It coughed, sputtered, caught for a moment that made her breath stop, then died again. Rebecca's eyes went wet. 3 weeks of work hours every night after shifts that left her exhausted, all the hope she'd invested in this moment threatening to collapse. Come on, girl, one more time. Third attempt. She turned the key and the starter cranked, and the engine coughed and caught and fired and sputtered and settled into rough idle that filled the machine shed with noise and smoke, blue mixing with black, the smell of diesel and burning oil thick enough to choke on. The whole machine vibrated beneath her alive in a way that felt almost miraculous. Lady was running. After 5 years sitting dead, after 68 years of existence, after being written off as worthless scrap, this tractor was working. Rebecca sat there, crying tears streaming down her face, while the engine rumbled and backfired and ran rough. But ran, proving something she'd needed to prove, not just to Ashley or Robert or the bank agent, but to herself. She shut the engine off after a minute, climbed down on shaking legs, stood looking at Lady in the dimness of the shed. Her hands were oil-stained and scarred from catching on sharp metal edges during the rebuild, marked by this work in ways that wouldn't wash away. You need a name. The tractor sat silent now, cooling metal, ticking as it contracted. Both of them had been written off, both abandoned, both dismissed as having no value left to give. But they'd proven otherwise. They were still here, still capable, still running. Lady, your name is Lady. Late May brought the neighbor. Rebecca was in the machine shed examining a disc harrow she'd found buried under tarps, trying to understand what parts were salvageable and what was just rust, shaped like farm equipment, when she heard the truck. Chevy pickup, older than Lady, but somehow in better shape, faded blue paint, and a diesel engine that knocked but ran. The man who climbed out moved with the careful economy of someone whose joints had been complaining for years, every motion deliberate to avoid unnecessary pain. 73 if he was a day, silver-white hair under a John Deere cap, weathered face that spoke of 50 years under Iowa sun. Overalls and plaid shirt, work boots that had been resoled at least twice, the leather cracked but maintained. His eyes went to the disc harrow, then to the farmhouse with its tarp-covered roof patch, then to Rebecca's grease-covered hands calculating something she couldn't quite read. You're the one bought the Peterson place. Rebecca wiped her hands on a rag that used to be a T-shirt. Rebecca Thompson, George Harris, farmed the land east of here. Heard someone finally took this property off the bank's hands. He walked closer, studying the disc with professional assessment, crouching down despite the protest of his knees, to examine blade edges and pivot points. "Where's your husband, ma'am?" That question again. That assumption baked so deep into the culture she could taste it. "Don't have one." George's eyebrows went up slightly, the only visible sign of surprise in a face that had probably mastered neutral expression decades ago. He looked at her again, reassessing with new information. "You're farming this alone." "Apparently." He stood, knees creaking audibly, and looked around the property with the kind of assessment that came from a lifetime of evaluating land equipment prospects. "What are you planning to plant?" "I don't know." "What should I plant?" The honesty seemed to satisfy something in him, the bluntness of admitting ignorance rather than pretending knowledge she didn't have. His face shifted fractionally toward something that might eventually become respect if she proved herself. "Hey, Timothy and clover mix. Simple forgiving, good first crop for someone learning." He paused, watching her absorb this information. "But you'll need to disc these fields first, drag them smooth, then seed." "How do I do that?" George pulled a rag from his back pocket, wiped hands that weren't dirty, buying himself time to decide something. "My wife Barbara didn't know farming when we got married. Came from town, worked at the library. Thought a combine was something you did with ingredients." His hands kept moving while he talked, checking bolts on the disc that Rebecca had already tightened, but not quite enough. "Took her 5 years to get good. 10 years before she was better than me at most of it. She had a feel for timing I never did, knew when to plant just by looking at the sky." "Where is she now?" George's hands paused for half a second, the only indication that the question had landed somewhere tender. "Died 3 years back. Heart just stopped one morning while she was feeding the chickens. Then she wasn't. The machinery shed filled with silence, heavier than grief, denser than sympathy." "I'm sorry. She'd want me to teach you." Barbara believed farming needed good people more than it needed experienced people. "Said you could teach experience, but not character." He looked at Rebecca, directly holding her gaze longer than was comfortable. She kept journals. Everything she learned, detailed notes on every season, every crop, every lesson. "Would you want them?" The offer hung in the air between them like something fragile. Next day, George returned with 5 leather-bound notebooks, dates stamped on the spines, running from 1975 to 2018. 43 years of Barbara's farming life, contained in these volumes that smelled like dust and old paper and someone else's history. Rebecca opened the first one that night by camping lantern, the air mattress uncomfortable beneath her, but forgotten as she read Barbara's handwriting, neat and precise, like someone who'd worked in libraries and valued clarity. June 1975. Don't know what I'm doing. George showed me the disc today. Watch how the soil breaks behind the blades, that tells you depth. Sketches of equipment with labeled parts, detailed enough that Rebecca could identify components she'd been staring at without comprehending. July 1975. First hay cutting. I was terrified, but you can't let fear stop you. A margin note in different ink added years later, the handwriting shakier. I was right. Fear is just fear. Do it anyway. Rebecca read until the lantern battery died, until her eyes couldn't focus anymore, feeling Barbara's presence across decades like a hand on her shoulder. This woman who hadn't known who'd learned who'd succeeded, and then written it all down so someone else could follow the same path. In the margin of the June entry, Rebecca wrote in pencil, "I hope you're right, Barbara." June heat turned the machine shed into an oven that made 4 hours the maximum she could work before heat exhaustion became a real concern. Rebecca started at 4:30 in the morning, the world's still dark ladies' engine, the only sound besides insects and the occasional distant truck on the county road. George came back with tools and patience Rebecca hadn't expected, showed her how to grease the disc bearings, adjust blade angles, check for wear patterns that indicated problems she'd never have noticed. He worked alongside her, but never did the work for her, letting her figure things out, even when it took longer, even when she made mistakes that cost time. Barbara took 5 years to get good, 10 before she was better than me. His calloused hands tightened. A bolt Rebecca had already tightened, showing her the difference between adequate and secure. She had a feel for timing, knew when to plant by looking at sky. Rebecca watched his movements, learning from the economy of motion the way he assessed before acting, the patience that came from decades of understanding that rushing created more problems than it solved. You'll get there. Takes practice. 6 hours a day on Lady, pulling the disc across 40 acres, the seat hard metal that left her backside bruised by day 2, steering heavy enough to require constant attention and muscle that her shoulders didn't have yet. By day 4, her hands had developed calluses on top of blisters that had burst and reformed. Her back screamed each morning when she tried to stand. Barbara's journal that night, "Your body will hurt. It means you're getting stronger. Don't quit." In the margin, Rebecca wrote, "Not quitting, Barbara. Promise." Second week of June brought another trip to the farm supply co-op. Machine oil replacement belt for ladies' fan fence staples for a project she hadn't started yet but knew was coming. Carol Martin stood behind the counter while 3 farmers talked by the feed display, their voices carrying across the store, with that particular volume of men who assumed everyone wanted to hear their opinions. "How long you think she lasts, woman alone, trying to farm 80 acres? Till first breakdown probably. Got no business doing this. Someone's going to get hurt." Rebecca kept her eyes on the belt display, pretending she couldn't hear, searching for the right size while her spine went rigid. One of the farmers turned to look at her directly, his gaze frank and assessing. "You're the one bought the old Peterson place, I am. That's hard work for a man. Can't imagine a woman managing it." Rebecca's posture straightened, that reflex honed by 20 years of having her competence questioned in dental offices by men who assumed she was there to hand instruments to the real dentist, to schedule appointments, to do the auxiliary work while men did what mattered. "I'm managing fine." Carol rang up her items, wouldn't quite meet her eyes. At first, the professional distance of someone who'd heard this conversation before and chosen not to intervene. But as Rebecca paid, Carol's voice came quietly across the counter. "Ignore them. I did." Rebecca looked up surprised. "I own this store. Bought it after my divorce 8 years ago. They said I'd fail too." First genuine smile Rebecca had exchanged with another woman since Ashley had driven away. "Come back if you need anything. I mean it." The vegetable garden she'd planted in early May was producing now faster than she could eat more than one person needed. Tomatoes, cucumbers, squash, green beans climbing the fence she'd built from scrap lumber and determination. She'd researched farmers' markets instead of building a roadside stand, found that Indianola held one every Saturday, $25 booth fee. She built a display table from barn lumber, following YouTube instructions, painted a sign by hand that read, Thompson Farm, grown with care, in letters that weren't professional but were honest. First Saturday brought $92 in sales, women mostly stopping to buy vegetables, but also to talk, to ask questions, to offer the kind of quiet support that didn't announce itself. Second week, a woman in her 70s bought tomatoes and paid an extra $5. For you, honey, keep going. You're showing these men something. Rebecca started a validation jar, saving those extra bills separate from revenue. Physical evidence that what she was doing mattered to people beyond just commerce. Women stopped not just for vegetables, but to say things they couldn't say to their own families. I wanted to do this, never had the courage. Rebecca's response came automatically, now refined through repetition. It wasn't courage, was stubbornness. July brought the Women's Farming Cooperative meeting, Carol's invitation extended casually at the co-op while ringing up supplies. There's a group of us, meet monthly, share challenges, solutions. Would you want to come? 12 women gathered in Linda Wilson's barn on a Saturday afternoon, ages ranging from 35 to 70, farmers and ranchers and women who kept bees or raised chickens or grew organic vegetables for restaurants in Des Moines. They shared problems Rebecca didn't know existed: certification, headaches, equipment, failures, market access, and solutions. She filed away for future reference. When it came her turn to introduce herself, Rebecca's voice caught. I'm Rebecca Thompson. I bought the old Peterson place 2 months ago. I'm learning as I go. The admission of ignorance felt dangerous until Linda Wilson spoke, her voice carrying the authority of 20 years farming organically. We all started somewhere. None of us knew everything. That's why we're here, to help each other. Offers came unprompted. I have extra seed if you need. Call me if equipment breaks. We support each other here. After the meeting, Linda pulled Rebecca aside, showed her the beehives at the edge of her property, wooden boxes arranged in neat rows. Barbara's journal mentioned starting bees. You ever thought about it? Rebecca hadn't, but listening to Linda explain pollination benefits and honey sales and the way bees fit into a farm ecosystem, she started to. I have a starter hive I can sell you. 2 boxes, established colony, $150. Rebecca's budget couldn't afford it, the math already tight between dental work and property taxes and equipment repairs that kept appearing. Pay me after your first harvest. We help each other. YouTube became her teacher again. Beekeeping for beginners. 20 videos watched over 3 nights note-taking until she felt confident enough to set up the hive Linda delivered. The bees arrived in early August, thousands of them humming inside the boxes, and Rebecca talked to them the way she talked to Lady. Okay, girls, let's make honey. August 5th brought George with hay equipment hitched to his John Deere, the mower and rake and baler, looking like they'd been maintained with the care of someone who understood that tools were investments that paid back over decades. I'll run the baler this time. You watch, learn. Next year, you'll do it. 2 days of work with Rebecca on Lady pulling the rake, while George ran the baler with efficiency born from thousands of hours muscle memory that made the complex machinery look simple. Bales dropped in neat rows across the field, 320 of them when they finished counting. They stacked them in the barn Rebecca had shored up with posts and prayers and hope that the structure wouldn't collapse under the weight. George walked through afterward, checking their work with professional assessment. "Good first cutting. You'll get another in September if we get rain. What's this worth?" He pulled out his phone, checked current hay prices. $6 a bale. If you can find buyers, I'll take 100 off you. Market rate. Math ran through Rebecca's head. $600 for George's purchase. She needed to sell the rest. Phone calls consumed 3 days working through a list George provided, offering hay at market rate, dealing with skepticism from farmers who wanted to know provenance and quality, and whether this woman who'd bought the Peterson disaster actually knew what she was doing. When she told them she'd grown it herself, the questions multiplied. "You cut this yourself. I had help with baling. What kind of barn conditions?" "Dry. Covered. No mold." She sold 200 bales to various farms within 20 miles. The remaining 20 went to a horse farm owned by a woman in her 60s who showed up in a pickup truck she drove herself. "Heard you were farming solo. Wanted to support that." Checks arrived over 2 weeks. Rebecca deposited them at the bank in Indianola, watching the balance climb from 6,000 to 7,800. Still not enough. Still barely treading water, but money she'd earned from crops she'd grown on land she owned. She sat in her Civic outside the bank afterward and cried into her hands, exhausted and proud, and terrified that this might actually work if she could just hold on long enough. September brought the first honey harvest. 20 pounds extracted using equipment borrowed from Linda, the process stocky and complicated, and more satisfying than anything Rebecca had done except maybe starting Lady's engine. She jarred it in containers, bought in bulk online, printed labels on her laptop, sold it at the farmer's market for $12 a pound. $240 from bees she'd been afraid of 2 months ago. Carol took jars on consignment at the co-op, 40-60 split. That felt fair. That gave Rebecca another income stream, thin as a trickle, but steady. November arrived with cold and the brutal math of winter approaching. Bank statement showed $2,400. Property taxes, due in December, were $800. Dental work brought $1,600 a month. Farmers market closed until spring. Honey sales through Carol averaged $200 monthly. The numbers barely worked even before accounting for heating costs, food, gas, equipment maintenance, the 1,000 small expenses that accumulated like snow. Rebecca ran scenarios at 2 a.m. on her laptop, sitting wrapped in blankets on the air mattress that had become her permanent bed, and all of them ended the same way. She needed income through winter, or she'd be selling this place by spring, proving everyone right about her inability to sustain this choice. January 15th arrived with temperatures that made the previous winter look mild. The thermometer George had left on his last visit read -17 Fahrenheit when Rebecca checked it at dawn. Coldest stretch Iowa had seen in 15 years, the kind of cold that killed exposed skin in minutes and made machinery brittle enough to shatter. She'd been burning through firewood she'd bought in town, the wood stove glowing cherry red and still barely keeping the farmhouse at 52 degrees. By midnight, the fire was roaring and heat was still escaping faster than she could generate. It's seeping out through gaps around windows, through the attic she couldn't afford to insulate properly, through floorboards that let cold air rise from the crawlspace below. At 2 a.m, she heard the crack like a gunshot from under the kitchen floor, sharp enough to jolt her awake. Then silence. Then the gurgling rush of water moving where it shouldn't, flooding the crawl space as frozen pipes burst and released their contents. Rebecca got up, pulled on boots over thermal underwear, and jeans, grabbed her flashlight. The crawl space access panel was in the closet floor wood, warped from humidity and age. She pried it open and shined light into darkness that looked like the entrance to someplace she shouldn't go, someplace that would trap her if she wasn't careful. Water was already pooling on the ground, 30 feet in freezing, as it spread, and the shut-off valve was buried behind ductwork and old insulation that someone had installed decades ago and never maintained. Two choices: let it flood and deal with the damage in morning, or stop it now before the entire crawl space became an ice rink that would take weeks to thaw. Rebecca lowered herself through the opening into cold so intense it felt like being punched, air temperature dropping the deeper she went, her breath coming in clouds that dissipated in the flashlight beam. She crawled on her belly through freezing mud and water that soaked through her clothes in seconds, the cold going past, uncomfortable into dangerous, the kind that made muscles stop working, made thinking go fuzzy, made dying seem like falling asleep. The valve was frozen solid ice coating the handle thick enough that she couldn't get purchase. She hit it with the flashlight, breaking ice away piece by piece, trying to get enough clearance to turn it. Her fingers wouldn't cooperate, numb and clumsy, even inside gloves that were now frozen solid against her skin. Robert's voice came back, memory from a decade ago. "You can't do this. You'll fail." She hit the valve harder, ice cracking under the impact, gripped it with both hands, threw her weight into turning it. Nothing. Again. The handle moved half an inch. "I'm not failing again." It turned. Water flow slowed, stopped. Rebecca crawled back through freezing water that wanted to trap her there, wanted to turn her into another piece of frozen debris that nobody would find until spring. She pulled herself up through the access panel and collapsed on the closet floor, shaking so hard her teeth clattered, muscles spasming from cold that had gone bone deep. The wood stove. She needed heat, or this crawl space trip was going to kill her just as effectively as drowning would have. She stripped off frozen clothes with fingers that didn't bend right, wrapped herself in dry blankets, fed the fire with every piece of wood she could reach without standing. Then sat there, shaking for an hour, waiting for warmth to seep back into her core, waiting to stop feeling like she was dying. Dawn came gray and bitter. George showed up at 7, took one look at her, and didn't ask questions. Just made coffee on her camping stove and sat while she drank it, the warmth spreading through her hands, first, then her chest. Pipes froze. "Heard you moving around middle of the night." "Figured. I shut off the water. Crawl space is flooded. We'll deal with it when it thaws. You made it through." Rebecca looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup, at this man who'd lost his wife 3 years ago and still came to check on a neighbor he barely knew. "Did I almost not?" George's silence was answer enough. "You're tougher than you look." "I have to be." His face shifted into something gentler than his usual expression, weathered features softening fractionally. "No. You choose to be. There's a difference. You could sell this place tomorrow. Walk away. Find an apartment. But you don't. That's choice, not necessity." The words settled into Rebecca like truth she'd been avoiding, soaking in deeper than the cold had. Every morning she woke up and chose to keep going, chose to keep fighting, chose to prove that broken didn't mean finished, just meant not fixed yet. Spring arrived in Fragment's March, thawing the ground enough that Rebecca could walk her fields without mud sucking at her boots. Year 2 brought confidence, born from surviving Year 1, from proving that stubbornness could substitute for knowledge if you refused to quit. The bank balance held $4,200 after winter's expenses, thin margin, but functional enough to plant and hope the harvest came through. She was in the machine shed, rebuilding a cultivator, when Andrew's truck appeared, the engine sound different enough from George's that she recognized it before he came into view. He parked and climbed out slowly, his face carrying news before his mouth formed words. George collapsed. Ambulance is taking him to Mercy Medical in Des Moines. The 40-minute drive felt eternal, Rebecca's hands white on the steering wheel, knuckles aching from grip. She couldn't relax. George had been there every week through winter, checking on her after the frozen pipe incident, bringing soup his daughter Judith had made, offering advice on spring planting schedules. He was 73. Hearts gave out at 73 bodies, decided they'd worked long enough. The hospital smelled like disinfectant, layered over fear fluorescent lights, making everyone look sick even when they weren't. Judith Harris met them in the waiting room, mid-40s, and dressed like she'd come straight from an office, makeup smudged from crying business suit, wrinkled from hours of sitting. Heart attack. They're running tests now. Doctor says he needs surgery. Is he going to be okay? Judith's face collapsed into something between anger and grief, the expression of someone watching a parent age faster than they'd prepared for. He's 73 years old. He should have quit farming 5 years ago. The words carried accusation, like somehow the land was responsible for George's heart giving out, like the choice to keep working had been violence instead of purpose. Hours passed in fragments of information delivered by nurses who'd perfected the art of saying nothing while appearing helpful. Stable. Surgery scheduled. Recovering. The words meant life instead of death, but also meant change, meant the world shifting again just when Rebecca had started to believe in stability. When they were finally allowed to visit, George looked diminished in the hospital bed tubes and wires connecting him to machines that beeped and hummed, monitoring systems Rebecca didn't understand. His eyes opened when she sat down. Damn heart quit on me, scared everyone, scared myself most. Judith appeared in the doorway, arms crossed in the protective stance of children watching parents become fragile. Doctor says no more farming, Dad. You have to accept that. George's jaw tightened, but his body's weakness undercut any fight he might have mounted. Rebecca watched him realize it, watched something break in his expression when he understood that decision had been made for him by biology and risk assessment, and the daughter who loved him enough to choose safety over autonomy. What am I supposed to do? Sit in a house and wait to die? Judith's voice cracked. I'm not watching you kill yourself for land. I'm selling the farm. The words landed like stones dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward. Getting you set up somewhere safe, not to developers. Dad, the developers are offering $280,000. That's retirement money, healthcare money. I don't care what they're offering. That land stays farmland. The fight drained from both of them. Exhaustion winning over stubbornness, fear winning over pride. Judith left to talk to doctors, and George looked at Rebecca with eyes that had lost their usual sharpness. Would you be interested? In what? Buying the farm, keeping it agricultural. Rebecca's throat went tight. airway constricting like someone had wrapped hands around her neck. "George, I barely manage 80 acres. How am I supposed to handle 235? You manage better than anyone I've seen in 40 years. And you'd preserve what Barbara and I built." The weight of it pressed down like physical force, expectation and responsibility and opportunity mixed so thoroughly she couldn't separate them. "I don't have that kind of money." George's hand moved to the bed rail, gripping it with what strength he had left. "Seller financing, 155 acres. I keep 5 and the house. Call it 185,000, 15% down, 800 a month for 15 years. Math spun through Rebecca's head, numbers multiplying faster than she could track. 27,750 down payment. She had 4,200 saved. Not even close. And the monthly payments would stack on top of everything else she was already struggling to cover. I'd need to pull from reserves, leave myself vulnerable. George's gaze held steady. "You'd need to take a risk. That's different than being vulnerable." Rebecca stood, walked to the window overlooking the parking lot where cars came and went, carrying people to and from their own crises, their own moments of choice that would define what came after. "Let me think about it. You have time to decide. Judith's giving me 3 months to either sell to her or find another buyer. After that, she's making the decision for me. 3 months, 90 days to figure out if she could handle expansion that would either establish the farm as sustainable or destroy everything she'd built." The Women's Farming Cooperative meeting fell on a Saturday. Rebecca hadn't planned to attend, her mind too occupied with George's offer to focus on anything else. But Carol had called, her voice carrying urgency Rebecca hadn't heard before. "You should come. Trust me." Linda Wilson's barn held the familiar circle of women, but the energy felt different, charged with something Rebecca couldn't identify until Linda started speaking. "We have a situation. One of our own needs help." Faces turned toward Rebecca, expressions ranging from sympathy to determination. "George Harris had a heart attack. He's selling his farm. Rebecca has an opportunity to buy it and keep it farming, but she needs capital she doesn't have." Heat rose in Rebecca's face, embarrassment at having her financial situation discussed like public business. But Linda kept talking. "How much do you need?" The directness of the question left no room for deflection. 27,750 for the down payment. "How much do you have?" 4,200. "So you need 23,550 more." Rebecca nodded, the deficit sounding larger when spoken aloud, more impossible than the calculations she'd been running in her head for days. Linda pulled out her checkbook. "I'll loan 5,000, 0 interest, pay when you can." Carol leaned forward from across the circle. "I'll do 3,000. One by one, women offered amounts they probably couldn't afford either, but were willing to risk anyway. 2,500, 2,000, 1,500, 800. The numbers accumulated on the notepad. Linda was using tallies, growing until they reached 17,300. Still short 6,250, but closer than Rebecca had imagined possible. The barn door opened, and Ashley walked in her presence, so unexpected that Rebecca's breath caught. Her daughter hadn't been home in 2 months. Phone calls brief and strained, the distance between them measured in more than miles. "What are you doing here?" Ashley's voice came quieter than usual, less certain. "Carol called me, told me what was happening." She crossed to stand in front of Rebecca, hands twisting together in nervousness that looked foreign on someone who'd always projected confidence. "I have 8,000 in savings, from summer jobs, birthday gifts, money I've been keeping for after graduation." "Ashley, what if I invested it for 10% equity in the farm?" The offer hung between them, mother and daughter, all the months of tension and disappointment and fear wrapped around this gesture. "You're in school. That's your future." "No, Mom, this is our future. I'm sorry I doubted you. I see what you've built. I want to be part of it." Rebecca pulled her daughter into a hug, both of them crying, while 12 women watched and applauded, while the math finally worked, while possibility became plan. 4,200. Rebecca had saved plus 8,000 from Ashley, plus 17,300 from the women's circle, equaled 29,500. More than the down payment with buffer left over. We invest in each other. That's what we do. Linda's voice carried the certainty of someone who'd built community deliberately, who understood that individual success meant nothing if everyone around you failed. June 1st brought closing day with thunderstorms that made the dirt roads nearly impassable, mud sucking at Tyers, the lawyer's office in Indianola, feeling impossibly far from the land Rebecca was buying. She signed 17 times again, her hand cramping by the end muscle memory from the first closing, making this one feel both familiar and surreal. George was there, despite doctor's orders, looking frailer than he had in the hospital, moving with the careful deliberation of someone aware their body had betrayed them once and might do it again. When the final signature went down and the land transferred, he handed over keys to equipment sheds Rebecca hadn't seen yet, his eyes wet at the edges. "Take care of her, the land. Barbara and I put everything into it. I promised George." Walking 235 acres felt different than walking 80, the scale overwhelming, until Rebecca stopped thinking about totals and focused on sections fields she could comprehend one at a time. The expansion meant more work than she could handle. Alone meant hiring help she couldn't afford, meant risk that made the first farm purchase look conservative. But it also meant survival, meant economy of scale that could turn marginal profit into sustainable income if she managed it correctly. Summer exploded into production that pushed every limit Rebecca thought she had, and then invented new ones. 80 acres of hay on the original land, 40 acres of oats on George's former fields, 20 acres of soybeans, 15 acres of vegetables expanded from the small plot that had been feeding farmers market sales. 3 beehives that had become 5 when Linda helped her split colonies in May. She hired Sarah Rodriguez from town, a 22-year-old who'd shown up at the farmer's market asking if the farm needed workers. "I want to learn how to do what you did." Rebecca looked at this young woman with determination written across her face and saw herself 3 years earlier standing in a lawyer's office with a check and no idea what came next. "It's hard work, long hours, not much pay to start. I don't care about easy. I care about learning something real." Ashley came home for summer, quit her job in Chicago before Rebecca even knew she'd been working there, showed up with 2 suitcases and announcement that she was staying. I can handle the business side, marketing, finances, planning. You focus on production. The role division made sense, freed Rebecca to do what she'd learned while Ashley managed what she was good at. Spreadsheets and projections, and the kind of organizational thinking that came naturally to her. August brought the organic certification inspector, a woman in her 50s, who spent 2 days reviewing every record Rebecca had kept walking, every field checking inputs and practices with professional skepticism designed to catch violations. The questions came rapid-fire testing for inconsistencies, for shortcuts that would disqualify certification. Rebecca answered honestly, showed documentation that bordered on obsessive, pointed to soil tests that proved the Petersons had stopped using chemicals years before she'd bought the place. 2 weeks later, the letter arrived. Thompson Farm Certified Organic, eligible to market all products with that designation to command premium prices that made the difference between surviving and thriving. Rebecca read the letter twice, called the Women's Circle to share the news, felt the weight of 3 years of work validated by an official stamp that said what she'd built met standards that had seemed impossible when she'd started. Year 2 harvest brought numbers that made the first year look like practice. 500 bales of hay at $8 each instead of $6, organic premium adding 33% to revenue. 40 acres of oats brought $3,200. Vegetables grossed $4,200 through expanded farmers market presence. Honey from 5 hives, $1,800. 30 chickens she'd added in spring, $600 in egg sales. Total revenue, $22,400. Operating costs, $13,200. Year 2 profit, $9,200. Rebecca sat in the farmhouse kitchen now with a table that didn't wobble, chairs that matched flooring that didn't have holes, and stared at the spreadsheet until the numbers stopped looking real. The farm was profitable, actually genuinely sustainably profitable if she could maintain production. Ashley leaned over her shoulder. "We did it, Mom. Did what proved it works. Everyone who said you'd fail, they were wrong." The validation felt hollow, somehow less important than Rebecca had expected. She hadn't done this to prove anyone wrong. She'd done it because quitting meant going back to being someone who needed permission, and that person had died somewhere between the lawyer's office and the auction, between the frozen crawl space and the morning lady's engine had fired. Year 3 arrived with heat that turned early summer into preview of hell. July came without rain, June's sparse showers, the last moisture the fields had seen. By the 10th of July, Rebecca's soybeans were showing stress leaves curling to conserve moisture that wasn't coming. The hay had been cut in June before the drought set in, but the second cutting wasn't growing stalks, stunted and brown where they should have been green and thriving. Ashley ran projections at the kitchen table while Rebecca stood at the window watching fields die. "We'll lose 40% of the crop without rain, maybe more." Rebecca's jaw tightened. "We'll find a way." "How you can't make it rain?" "No, but I can keep working." The Women's Farming Cooperative called an emergency meeting Drought Strategies, shared by women who'd survived 1988, who remembered what it took to get through seasons when the sky forgot how to open. Linda talked about irrigation techniques Rebecca couldn't afford to implement. Carol mentioned drought-resistant varieties for next year, information that helped planning but did nothing for crops already in the ground. The emotional support mattered more than the practical advice. The knowledge that other women had faced this and survived that drought was crisis, but not necessarily catastrophe if you refuse to let it become one. Barbara's journal from August 1988. Worst drought in my lifetime. Almost broke us. George wanted to sell. I said no. Sometimes all you can do is keep planting, keep hoping. Rebecca wrote in the margin, I choose to keep going too, Barbara. August 1st marked 75 days without meaningful rain. The soybeans were lost, causes stalks brittle enough to snap when Rebecca walked through to assess damage. Vegetables were dying, despite hand watering that consumed hours each day. Even the bees were struggling, not enough flowers blooming to sustain honey production. The math turned brutal. George's payment due, $800, women's circle loans, $500 monthly, operating costs, $2,200. Income plummeting with each day of cloudless sky. Rebecca knelt in the soybean field at dawn, dirt dry, and cracked beneath her knees, the kind of drought cracks that opened wide enough to trap your foot if you weren't careful. She ran soil through her fingers, and it fell like sand, devoid of the moisture that made it productive. I don't know if we can survive this, girl. She was talking to a lady parked at the field edge, engine silent, but presence comforting in the way that inanimate objects could be when you'd poured enough of yourself into them. Robert's voice came back, memory she hadn't heard in months, the neural pathway almost atrophied from disuse. See, I told you, you can't do this. Rebecca stood brushing dirt from her jeans, looking across fields that should have been thriving, but were dying. Instead, looking at the risk she'd taken and the price failure would exact. Barbara's journal that night offered the only comfort available. We chose to keep going. George wanted to sell. I said no. In the margin, Rebecca wrote words that felt like prayer or promise, or both. I choose to keep going too. August 22nd arrived with sound that pulled Rebecca from sleep at 3 in the morning. Not alarm, but something else, something she couldn't immediately identify. She lay on the bed, real bed now, not air mattress, and listened. Rain, not drizzle, not the teasing sprinkles that evaporated before reaching ground. Real raindrops heavy enough to drum against the roof, thunder rolling across fields like warning and promise mixed together. Rebecca ran outside in the t-shirt and underwear she slept in, stood in the farmyard with arms spread wide, face turned up to sky that had finally remembered how to open. Water soaked through her clothes, in seconds plastered her hair to her skull. Rain so thorough it felt like baptism or resurrection or both. Ashley came out from the room she'd claimed stood next to her mother without speaking, both of them present for miracle. That was just meteorology, but felt like intervention. The rain continued for 3 days, 6 inches total, enough to revive what could be saved, enough to transform brown fields back toward green, enough to prove that sometimes survival was just refusing to quit long enough for circumstances to shift. Late August harvest brought numbers that looked like disaster compared to year 2, but felt like victory given the drought. 600 bales of hay at $10 each, 6,000. Soybeans were mostly lost, but what remained brought 3,500. Vegetables damaged, but viable, 2,800. Honey production down, but not eliminated, 2,400. Chickens had thrived despite everything, 1,000. Total, 18,700. After costs, 6,200 profit. Less than year two, but enough to make George's payment enough to start paying back the women's circle at $500 monthly, enough to prove the model could survive even when nature fought against it. The Women's Farming Cooperative Spring Conference drew 60 women from across Iowa. Farmers and ranchers and women who kept bees or grew herbs or raised heritage, breed livestock. Linda had asked Rebecca to speak 3 weeks earlier, the invitation carrying expectation Rebecca wasn't sure she could meet. "I've never done public speaking. You've done harder things." The barn was full when Rebecca stood at the front, Ashley sitting in the second row for moral support, women she recognized from monthly meetings scattered throughout the crowd. Her hands shook holding notes she'd written and rewritten until the words stopped sounding like her voice. 3 years ago, I sat in a lawyer's office with $38,000 and no future. The opening line steadied her somehow, the truth of it grounding her enough to continue. I was 42 and didn't know who I was without someone telling me. I bought a farm nobody wanted because I related to it. Both written off, both abandoned. This farm taught me I'm capable of more than I imagined. But more important, this community taught me I don't have to do it alone. A young woman near the back raised her hand, late 20s, voice shaking when Rebecca nodded to her. "My husband left last year. I have 2 kids. I feel helpless, like I can't do anything without him." The room went quiet, women recognizing their own stories in this stranger's admission. Rebecca's response came without thinking, words she'd needed to hear 3 years ago. "You're not helpless. You're told you are. There's a difference. One is truth. The other is permission to quit. Don't give anyone permission to make you smaller than you are." The applause started in the front row and spread backward. Women standing, some crying, the room recognizing itself in Rebecca's words, and the young woman's question, and the collective understanding that strength was choice, not gift. Winter of year 3 brought Lady's final restoration. Rebecca worked in the heated machine shed Andrew had helped her insulate, spending evenings after farm work, carefully stripping decades of paint, applying primer she'd researched for weeks, repainting in the original 1955 Alice Chalmers red that she'd found color codes for through vintage tractor forums online. New decals ordered from a company in Wisconsin that specialized in agricultural restoration. Every system rebuilt to better than factory specification parts, sourced through networks. Carol had connected her to hours invested that returned nothing except satisfaction. One imperfection remained deliberate. The dent in the hood from the wrench she'd dropped during the first rebuild, during those weeks when she'd been teaching herself to fix what everyone said was unfixable. Ashley stood in the shed doorway watching her work. "I can hammer that out, Mom. Make it perfect." Rebecca ran her fingers over the dent, feeling the depression in metal that was otherwise smooth. Some scars should stay. They tell our story. April 3rd, 2026. Exactly 3 years since the divorce. 3 years since the settlement check with her name spelled wrong. 3 years since she'd started becoming someone new. The farm open house brought 50 people to walk fields that were ready for spring planting, to tour the barn that no longer leaned to see equipment that actually ran instead of rusting in sheds. Local paper sent a photographer headline printed the next day, "Local woman builds thriving farm after divorce." Rebecca stood on the porch overlooking 235 acres and found words that had been building for 3 years, truth that had accumulated slowly until it demanded expression. The settlement check said I was worth $38,000, but I was worth so much more than that. I just had to prove it to myself. She gestured toward the machine shed where Lady sat, visible through the open door, red paint gleaming except for one deliberate imperfection. Lady and we had something in common, both written off as worthless, both told we were finished. But broken didn't mean finished, just meant not fixed yet. The crowd included women from the farming cooperative, neighbors, who'd watched her struggle, customers from the farmer's market, who'd supported her with purchases and encouragement. George sat in a chair someone had brought out, recovered enough to visit, though not to farm Judith beside him, with expression that had softened from fear to something approaching pride. This farm employs 2 people, serves 100 families through the farmer's market, produces certified organic food, makes enough profit to be sustainable. But more important, it proves you can rebuild. At any age, from any loss, you just have to choose to keep going. Evening brought quiet after the crowd dispersed, Ashley and Rebecca sitting on the porch, watching sunset paint fields gold and amber. Lady was visible in the machine shed, the dent in her hood catching light imperfection that made the restoration honest instead of false. "Mom, are you happy?" Rebecca thought about the question, really considered it instead of offering automatic response. Happy felt insufficient for what she'd become, too simple for the complexity of building life from ruins. "I'm complete. That's better than happy." Happy is a feeling, comes and goes. Complete is a state of being. I'm whole now. All the pieces fit. She paused, watching the sun drop lower. This is mine. Every scar, every triumph, every lesson learned in dirt and grease. Mine. Ashley took her hand, the gesture carrying 3 years of journey from doubt to understanding to partnership. "You're my hero. You know that I'm just someone who refused to quit. That's what makes you a hero." After Ashley went inside, Rebecca walked to the machine shed alone. Lady sat in shadows that were gathering as daylight faded, red paint gleaming in the last light, that one dent visible if you knew where to look. She touched the cold metal, feeling weight of 3 years in that contact. A tractor written off as scrap had become backbone of successful farm. A woman dismissed as broken had built her own future, both still working, both irreplaceable, both proof that endings were just beginnings if you had courage to start. "Thank you for running with me, girl. We're not done yet." The farmhouse windows glowed yellow behind her, light spilling out onto ground she'd bought when nobody else wanted it. Land she'd brought back to production through stubbornness and YouTube videos, and women who'd believed in her when belief was all they had to offer. 68 years Lady had existed before Rebecca found her. 3 years they'd been running together. However many more came after would be built on foundation they'd established, on the understanding that broken was just a temporary state, that running again was always possible if you refused to accept that stillness was permanent. She turned off the shed light, walked back to the farmhouse, through darkness that held no fear anymore, through land that answered to her name, through air that smelled like spring and soil, and the promise of another season starting. The door closed behind her with solid clickwood fitting properly in frame. She'd repaired herself, hinges, she'd oiled threshold, she'd leveled. Everything in this house bore marks of her labor, evidence of choosing to fix rather than abandon, to build rather than flee. Tomorrow would bring work, fields to prepare seeds, to plant equipment, to maintain all the endless tasks of farming that would continue as long as she chose to continue them. But tonight she could rest in the knowledge that she'd proven the only thing that mattered, that she was worth more than $38,000, more than a marriage that had diminished her more than any single moment of choice, or crisis, or doubt. She was worth the work she'd done and the community she'd built and the future she was creating one season at a time. The settlement check had spelled her name wrong, but Rebecca Thompson had spelled her life right, letter by letter, choice by choice, morning after morning, of waking up and deciding that today she would keep running, today she would keep building, today she would keep proving that the only permission she needed was the permission she gave herself.